Pete Hegseth did not arrive in Washington as a quiet bureaucrat. He arrived as a fighter in public, a media figure, a loyalist, a man who projected certainty in a city built on ambiguity. And when Donald Trump put him in charge of the Pentagon, that certainty suddenly came with one of the most dangerous responsibilities in the world: control over military information, military timing, and military force. In that role, the smallest decision can alter diplomacy, destabilize a region, or put American service members in danger. At that level, secrecy is not style, it is survival. That is what makes this story so explosive. Because this is not a scandal about a speech gone wrong, or a headline taken out of context, or a political rival trying to score points. This is a scandal about whether the man responsible for safeguarding war-related information handled it with the kind of discipline that job demands. And in Washington, that is the kind of question that can linger longer than any denial. The official story at first sounded almost too absurd to be real. A group chat, on Signal, senior national security officials, a journalist added by mistake. It sounded like the kind of thing that would be dismissed in the first hour as rumor or parody. But the White House confirmed the authenticity of the chat, and the problem immediately became larger than embarrassment. Reuters reported that the group included top Trump administration officials and was discussing planned strikes on Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi forces before those strikes were carried out on March 15, 2025. And Pete Hegseth was not a bystander in that story. He was one of the central figures in it. That distinction matters, because when a Secretary of Defense is swept into a scandal, the stakes are different from those of a normal political controversy. Cabinet officials survive bad press all the time. They survive criticism, infighting, and ideological warfare. But a scandal tied to military timing and operational detail lands in another category entirely. It raises questions not just about judgment, but about whether power was exercised with the seriousness the office requires. In theory, the Pentagon is built on layers of control, classified systems, need-to-know restrictions, procedures designed precisely to prevent sensitive military details from drifting into the wrong channel, the wrong room, or the wrong hands. Those systems exist because war is not just about what happens on the battlefield. It is also about who knows what and when. Timing can be the difference between mission success and disaster. Even partial information can create risk. That is why this scandal hit so hard. Not because it involved gossip, not because it looked messy, but because it appeared to cut against the most basic expectation of war leadership: that people entrusted with lethal state power understand the boundary between casual communication and protected information. Reuters later reported that the Pentagon Inspector General's review examined whether the use of Signal, an unclassified commercial messaging platform, violated Department of Defense policy, and whether the information shared should have been classified. Those are not minor administrative questions. Those are structural questions about national security behavior. And yet, in the earliest stage of the controversy, there was still a battle over language. Hegseth insisted that no war plans had been texted. Administration officials pushed back on descriptions they viewed as exaggerated. But Washington scandals are often decided less by the exact label than by the underlying picture. And the underlying picture here was already brutal. A defense secretary, a live military operation, a commercial chat app, and a journalist who should never have been there. This was no longer just about whether a phrase had gone too far. It was about whether the habits of power inside the Trump national security circle had become dangerously loose. And if that was true, then Pete Hegseth was not just facing a press problem. He was facing the oldest question in military command. Can a man be trusted with war if he cannot control where its secrets go? The scandal began with a mistake so simple it sounded impossible. According to Reuters, Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, was mistakenly included in a Signal group chat used by top Trump administration officials as they discussed the planned U.S. strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. The very existence of that chat was stunning enough. But what turned the episode into a national security scandal was not merely who was in the room. It was what was reportedly being said there before the bombs fell. The group itself reportedly included some of the most senior figures in U.S. national security. That made the chat feel, in a strange way, both modern and reckless at the same time. This was not a rogue leak from a low-level staffer. It was a thread populated by people at the top of government discussing a live military action over a commercial app. The name of the group, Reuters reported, was Houthi PC Small Group. Even that detail gave the story a disturbing intimacy. Something enormous was being discussed in a format that felt small, fast, and informal. And that is where Pete Hegseth's role became critical. Because Reuters reported that the messages included operational details about the planned March 15th strike, and later coverage stated that screenshots showed Hegseth texting the start time for the planned killing of a Houthi militant leader, along with details of further U.S. airstrikes. Whether one chooses to call that war plans, attack details, or sensitive operational information, the political damage came from the same place. This was the kind of information people expect the defense secretary to lock down, not pass through a consumer messaging app. That is why the story spread with such speed. Even before any formal investigation reached a conclusion, the outline alone was enough to trigger outrage. Lawmakers demanded answers. Critics argued that if the information had been intercepted by an adversary before the strike, American personnel and the mission itself could have been placed at risk. Reuters later reported that the Pentagon Inspector General reviewed whether the information from the military had been classified at the time it was transmitted, and whether it could have endangered service members had the chat been intercepted. The Houthi campaign itself already sat inside a volatile regional picture. The Houthis had been attacking shipping in and around the Red Sea, and the United States had framed military action as part of a broader response to those threats. In that context, operational secrecy was not a ceremonial concern. It was central to the execution of force. That is part of why the Signal Scandal felt so jarring to observers inside and outside government. The state was using military power in a tense theater, but the communications around that power appeared to belong to the age of casual texting. Hegseth's defenders argued that the press was inflating the story and that no classified information had been sent. That defense became one of the core lines of resistance around him. But politically, it had limits. Because the images released and the descriptions reported by Reuters kept pushing the scandal back toward the same central problem. If the defense secretary is discussing timing and attack sequencing in a channel that can accidentally include a journalist, then the barrier between official war, management, and careless exposure has already weakened. This was the point at which the scandal ceased to be merely humiliating. It became symbolic. It symbolized a style of governance in which speed, access, and loyalty seemed to blur the formal rules that normally govern military power. It made critics ask whether the Trump team had imported the habits of campaign politics and media culture into spaces where those habits do not belong. And it made Pete Hegseth the face of that question because, unlike a spokesman or advisor, he sat at the center of the institution meant to prevent exactly this kind of risk. A war plan does not need to be printed on paper to be dangerous. A leak does not need to come from espionage to do damage. Sometimes the scandal begins with something much smaller. A phone screen, a typing window, and a message sent with too much confidence to too many people. And by the time Washington understood that, the Signal chat had already become more than a mistake. It had become a test of whether Pete Hegseth's Pentagon understood the difference between access and control. Scandals often turn on one key question, not whether something looked bad, not whether critics overreacted, but whether the facts, once stripped of rhetoric, still carry danger. In Pete Hegseth's case, that question was brutally simple. What exactly was sent, and how sensitive was it? Reuters reported that screenshots released after the controversy showed Hegseth texting the start time for a planned killing of a Houthi militant leader and details of further U.S. airstrikes. Reuters also reported that The Atlantic described the broader chat as containing targets, weapons, and sequencing information tied to the March 15th operation. That matters because in military operations, timing is not some decorative detail. It is operational oxygen. It shapes surprise, force protection, and the enemy's ability to react. Hegseth denied that he had shared war plans. His allies echoed that framing and argued that the political opposition and the media were stretching the meaning of the messages. In Washington, that kind of semantic battle is standard, but it only works if the underlying material feels routine. Here, the underlying material did not feel routine at all. Even former officials and lawmakers who disagreed on plenty of other issues recognized timing and targeting discussions as among the most sensitive forms of pre-strike information. Reuters later reported exactly that. Democrats and former U.S. officials viewed timing and targeting details as some of the most closely held material before a U.S. military campaign, and there was a reason for that reaction. If hostile actors learn that a strike is coming, they can move. They can conceal personnel. They can use civilians as cover. They can scatter leadership, alter routes, or exploit the delay between knowledge and execution. Reuters reported that if Houthi leaders had known a strike was coming, they might have fled, potentially into crowded areas where targeting becomes more difficult, and civilian casualty concerns might halt the operation. That possibility is exactly why operational detail is supposed to live inside disciplined channels. Still, the story remained legally and politically complicated. Reuters also reported that the chat did not appear to include names or precise locations of militants being targeted, nor information that could have directly enabled someone to attack U.S. troops carrying out the operation. That detail matters because it limits the most extreme version of the case against Hegseth. The scandal was serious, but not every serious scandal reaches the same threshold of harm. The point was not that every possible secret had been spilled. The point was that enough apparently sensitive detail had moved through the wrong channel to create a genuine national security controversy. And that distinction made the scandal more durable, not less. Because once the conversation moves from, "Did he leak everything?" to, "Why was any of this handled this way at all?" the defense becomes harder. The official standard for a Secretary of Defense is not merely avoiding catastrophic disaster. It is maintaining a level of rigor that prevents needless risk in the first place. That is why the Pentagon Inspector General's probe mattered so much. Reuters reported that the review examined whether Department of Defense policies had been violated and whether the information should have been classified. That transformed the dispute from a media fight into a formal accountability process. And then there was another damaging detail. Reuters later reported that Hegseth declined to be interviewed by the Inspector General's office and instead submitted a written statement asserting that he was allowed to declassify information as he deemed appropriate and that he had only texted information he did not think posed an operational risk. That explanation may have satisfied his supporters, but for critics, it deepened the concern. Because the issue was no longer just whether the content had crossed a technical line, it was whether the Secretary's own instincts about that line were fundamentally too loose. In other words, the scandal survived because it was not just about one message. It was about judgment, about whether a defense secretary saw military timing as sacred information or flexible material, about whether a high office was being operated with wartime caution or political confidence, about whether the most dangerous facts in government were being treated as facts that belong nowhere near informal convenience. And once a scandal becomes a judgment scandal, it gets harder to contain, because documents can be disputed, terminology can be massaged, allies can go on television and complain about unfair coverage, but the image remains: a defense secretary, a phone, a live operation, a message sent before the strike. And for many people watching, that was enough to make one conclusion inescapable. Pete Hegseth may not have needed to send a complete war plan to create a war-level scandal. He only needed to send enough. The moment a scandal touches war, Washington reacts differently. A normal controversy divides along familiar lines: party, ideology, loyalty, outrage. But once military secrecy enters the frame, another set of actors appears: inspectors general, congressional committees, judges, records laws, and bureaucratic mechanisms that do not care how forcefully someone performs on television. That is when a scandal stops living only in the news cycle and starts moving through institutions. That is exactly what happened to Pete Hegseth. Reuters reported that after the Signal disclosures, lawmakers demanded investigations, and a bipartisan push emerged for greater scrutiny. One Reuters report noted that Senate Armed Services Committee leaders sought a review. Another described how lawmakers, particularly Democrats, condemned the incident as a serious national security breach. This mattered because the scandal was no longer framed solely as partisan media warfare. It had entered the machinery of state oversight. Then came the Pentagon Inspector General. Reuters reported on April 3, 2025, that the Pentagon watchdog opened a probe into Hegseth's use of Signal to coordinate matters related to the March 15 airstrikes against the Houthis. The review was tasked with examining whether use of the unclassified commercial app violated Defense Department policy and whether any of the information discussed should have been classified. That is a devastating development for any defense secretary because it takes the scandal out of the realm of perception and places it in the realm of formal process. But even that was not the full extent of the fallout. Reuters also reported that a federal judge ordered the Trump administration to preserve Signal messages discussing the planned Yemen strikes after a lawsuit raised concerns that auto-deleting messages could violate federal record-keeping laws. That ruling did not determine whether national security rules had been broken, but it widened the scandal. The issue was no longer just whether sensitive military information had been mishandled. It was also whether the government's handling of those messages had collided with transparency and records preservation requirements. That is how scandals metastasize in Washington. One day the issue is a shocking news report. The next day it is an oversight problem. Then it becomes a legal preservation problem. Then a competence problem. Then a leadership problem. And because all of those layers were developing at once, Hegseth faced a crisis that could not be solved by a single denial or a single press statement. Meanwhile, the administration tried to hold the line. Reuters reported that Trump stood by Hegseth even as criticism intensified. Supporters dismissed the uproar as politically motivated and media-driven. But that defense had a vulnerability. The deeper the institutional review went, the less the scandal depended on editorial framing. The question was no longer simply whether opponents hated Hegseth. The question was what the records, screenshots, and official reviews would ultimately say about his conduct. And by late 2025, Reuters reported that the Inspector General's report had faulted Hegseth over the Signal episode, according to sources familiar with it. Reuters said the report found that the information from the U.S. military had been classified at the time it was transmitted to Hegseth, and that the material could have put service members and the mission at risk if the chat had been intercepted. The Pentagon publicly said the review cleared him, and Hegseth declared, "No classified information. Total exoneration. Case closed." But the split between the Pentagon's public posture and the reported findings only ensured the controversy would not die cleanly. That tension is important, because scandals do not always end with a resignation, an indictment, or a confession. Sometimes they end in something politically more corrosive, dueling realities. One side says the official was vindicated, the other says the facts were damning. And the public is left with a familiar question in the Trump era. Was this a witch hunt? Or was this a warning everyone chose to ignore? For Hegseth, the damage was broader than any one headline. The Signal scandal began to define him not as a warrior reformer or loyal enforcer, but as a man whose management of military secrecy had become a national argument. It turned his leadership style into evidence. It made informality look like recklessness, and it forced even sympathetic observers to confront a hard truth. In national security, discipline is not measured by how tough you sound after the fact. It is measured by what you protect before the strike begins. By then, the scandal had moved beyond embarrassment. Washington was no longer just asking what Pete Hegseth said, it was asking what kind of Pentagon he was running. If the first Signal story was humiliating, the second one was corrosive. Because a single catastrophic mistake can sometimes be explained away as a freak accident, a wrong contact, a bizarre lapse, a one-time breakdown in process. But when a second channel appears, and it appears to contain similar conduct, the scandal changes shape. It stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like habit. Reuters reported in April 2025 that Hegseth shared details of the March attack on Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthis in a second Signal group that included his wife, his brother, and his personal lawyer, according to a source familiar with the matter. Reuters said the second chat included about a dozen people and had originally been created during his confirmation process to discuss administrative issues rather than detailed military planning. Yet according to the report, Hegseth shared details of the strike schedule there as well. That revelation hit differently from the first one. The first story centered on a mistaken inclusion of a journalist in a high-level group. That was shocking because it suggested the system had failed. The second story suggested something potentially worse, that the use of Signal for sensitive military discussion may have extended into a semi-personal network far removed from the formal logic of need-to-know government communication. That is the kind of detail that turns a scandal from procedural into cultural. It suggests a world view in which the boundaries around power have become too casual, and this is where the scandal becomes bigger than Pete Hegseth alone. Because the real issue was never just Signal. Signal was the vessel. The deeper issue was whether senior officials in a wartime chain of responsibility had come to treat secure judgment as optional. The app did not create the problem by itself. The app simply exposed a governing style that seemed more comfortable with speed and intimacy than with institutional restraint. Even the details around the second chat added to that discomfort. Reuters reported that Hegseth's wife, Jennifer, had attended sensitive meetings with foreign military counterparts and that his brother worked as a Department of Homeland Security liaison to the Pentagon. Those details do not prove wrongdoing by the people around him, but they sharpened the optics of the scandal. They reinforced the sense that official space and personal space were bleeding into each other in ways that would alarm anyone expecting a stricter military culture at the top. By the end of 2025, Reuters reported that the Inspector General's review also noted awareness of several other Signal chats used for official business, according to comments cited in response to the report. That detail made the controversy even harder to dismiss as isolated. The danger was no longer merely what happened in one notorious chat. The danger was the possibility that a broader pattern of informal encrypted messaging had become normalized inside official work streams tied to national security. And that is why the Signal scandal matters. Not because it delivered the cinematic ending people often expect from political scandals. There was no single clean moment of collapse that satisfied everyone. Trump stood by Hegseth. Hegseth maintained that no classified information had been shared. The Pentagon publicly signaled support. Yet the scandal still endured because it had already done something politically permanent. It reframed how people understood his leadership. Before the scandal, Hegseth could be seen as a blunt instrument of Trumpian military politics, aggressive, ideological, and unapologetic. After the scandal, he was also the man tied to a war-related messaging controversy so serious that it triggered congressional anger, an inspector general investigation, a federal records preservation fight, and renewed scrutiny after a second Signal chat emerged. That accumulation matters more than any one talking point. In politics, repetition is what turns controversy into identity, and maybe that is the real lesson here. Modern power no longer leaks only through spies, defectors, and hidden microphones. Sometimes it leaks through convenience, through overconfidence, through the illusion that because a message is private, it is safe, through the culture of modern executive life where encrypted apps can make dangerous conversations feel ordinary. But war is never ordinary. The preparation for violence by a state is one of the gravest acts a government can undertake, and the people entrusted with it are expected to act as if that gravity applies to every channel, every word, every screen. That is why Pete Hegseth Signal Scandal will likely outlive the argument over terminology. Maybe it was not the complete exposure of every battlefield secret. Maybe supporters will always insist the press exaggerated the meaning of what was sent. But the scandal did not survive because every critic agreed on every word. It survived because the core image was too powerful to erase. A Secretary of Defense discussing the timing of military action in a chat environment that proved incapable of guaranteeing control. And once that image exists, it leaves a mark. Because in the end, the most damaging thing about this scandal was not simply that sensitive details may have been shared. It was that the man trusted with war appeared, at minimum, far too comfortable treating its margins like a message thread.